Recording is in progress, and I work in MongoDB, and we're going to talk about scaling large production clusters with partitioned synchronization. This is by some authors from Alibaba and Chinese University of Hong Kong. Usenix this year, where I think it won a Best Paper Award or something like that. And it's about scheduling tasks on a cluster of machines. So the model of a task schedule here is that you've got a bunch of clients, and the clients submit tasks to schedulers, and then schedulers commit resources to those tasks. So that might be running a task on a specific machine, or it might be more fine-grained than that. We don't really get into that kind of detail. Resources and tasks are one-to-one during the time that the task is running. So you can't have a resource do multiple tasks at a time. Not all of these resource slots are the same. Some are higher quality and some are lower quality. And that might be that the higher quality slots have more CPU or more hard drive, or they cached data that you already need. We're also a little bit unclear on what quality means, and that's going to be my main criticism of this paper, but we'll get to that later. So their goals, they have a task scheduler already, which conks out at a couple of thousand tasks per second. So they want to scale up to 40,000 new tasks submitted per second, running on a cluster of 100,000 worker machines. And the tasks have a variety of runtimes, but the average is around 5 seconds. They want low latency scheduling, meaning that very soon after a task is submitted, it starts running with a resource. And they also want high quality scheduling, which means that tasks and resources are well matched. And these two goals are in conflict. They've also got some.
Under no circumstances does a task get assigned twice.
Twice? What do you mean?
Well, they're scheduling tasks, so you're not overbooking the task ever.
Oh, that's right. A resource is committed to a task, and then the task runs. And if that commitment fails, then it retries until it gets it, but it doesn't.
But the resource,
I think it's sort of like hedged.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no hedging.
Okay.
So their constraints are that they can't just, if they've got N schedulers, they don't want to just partition up the resources and assign each resource to one scheduler. They want to have this many-to-many relationship in order to have global fairness rules that they try to uphold. And also, obviously, they can't just have one scheduler because they tried that and it doesn't scale well enough for their load. So they're going to start off in this paper by describing what they call the baseline scheduler, which is kind of like the simplest scheduler that could possibly work. And that will be the thing against which their solution is evaluated. So the baseline scheduler, a client submits a task to a random scheduler. The scheduler just chooses some slot at random. It doesn't care if that slot is already committed or not. It doesn't care about that slot's quality. It just tries it. And if it fails, then it retries forever until it gets lucky and manages to assign a slot to a task. Retrying obviously adds a lot of latency. So if you start off by assuming that there are 0 conflicts and that each scheduler can handle k tasks per second, then if the total load is j tasks per second, then we need n schedulers where it's j divided by the speed of each scheduler. But that's just idealized. There will actually be conflicts. So one strategy is to add additional slots to reduce conflicts. Now, after this, they do half a page of math to come up with the expected number of conflicts given the number of extra slots that they add to the system, the number of schedulers you have, and the number of tasks per second that each scheduler can handle.
Hey, Jesse, what exactly is the conflict?
A conflict is when two schedulers try to commit the same slot to two different tasks. And the task could either already be running or not. I think the task is probably already running at that point. So you try to assign a slot to a task, but another task already has that slot.
And so the slot itself adjudicates, I'm already busy, so go away.
Yeah, I believe that's right.
You actually are overbooking these things, but the slot itself adjudicates that it can't do it.
Correct. And then a scheduler retries.
Okay.
So the kind of important thing about this formula here is just that it's, because you've got a constant divided by the number of idle slots raised to a power. That means that it's a asymptotic curve. So I plugged in a few constants and made a graph. And you can see that as the number of idle slots increases, the number of conflicts asymptotically approaches zero, but not very fast. You have to add a lot of idle slots in order to reduce the conflict rate by a little bit. So, and remember, like an idle slot is an actual physical machine in a hot data warehouse. It takes power, it costs money. So we want to find some other strategy for reducing conflicts rather than just adding a bunch of extra capacity. So they're going to focus on some other sources of problems in their system. One of them is variability. So some slots are more desirable than others, and they say that V is the variance of the slot's quality score. I think that this is a kind of a weak spot in the paper because I would think that some tasks would prefer certain slots and other tasks would prefer other slots based on what kind of hardware it's got, whether a particular machine has data cached that the next task also wants. I believe that this paper is assuming that all of the tasks have the same ranking of slot scores. And I think that that's unrealistic, but somebody can correct me if that's not what they're assuming. So there's variance, and then the other problem is staleness. So schedulers don't learn the global state instantly. There's some synchronization gap, which they call G, which is the time period between changes at the slot and global synchronization, which is when schedulers find out about what's happening at a slot. So the more staleness you have, the more conflicts there are, because the more likely you are that a scheduler will think that a slot is free when in fact it's running. Or vice versa. Either of those will reduce the ability to schedule tasks. I think the way this works, I felt like the paper was a little bit unclear on this, but a slot knows whether it's committed or idle, and its state changes either when a task is assigned to it by some scheduler or when the task finishes. Each scheduler has its own copy of each slot's state, and each scheduler can be arbitrarily stale. There's some periodic refresh, which updates the state, but the slower that refresh is, then the staler the scheduler is, and the more conflicts that will cause. So reducing the impact of this staleness is the paper's main contribution, and they call their strategy partitioned synchronization. They say that our main idea is to reduce the staleness of the local states, and that they also want to find a good balance between resource quality, which is slot score, and scheduling efficiency. So here's how the partitioned synchronization algorithm works. You've got a bunch of slots and a bunch of schedulers, and you divide up the slots into partitions. And in a round of synchronization, you synchronize the state from some slots to some schedulers. And each round of synchronization refreshes the state of some of the partitions to each of the schedulers. Hope that makes sense. So this could be round one. And then in round two, you shift everything to the left. So this partition synchronizes to a different scheduler, and this one, and so on. So that would be round two. And then for round three, you kind of permute everything again so that the partitions are now synchronized to the final combination of schedulers. And that's round three, and then the cycle repeats. That means that over the course of some number of cycles, every scheduler gets its view refreshed of some of the partitions. And for the duration of that round, every scheduler has a fresher view of one partition than all the other schedulers do. And this is going to be important in a minute. So the paper spends a little bit of time analyzing the total amount of staleness in the system with various strategies. So let's say that the synchronization gap is G seconds. This is how long it takes to refresh. If you were just going to do it all in one round, this is how long it would take to refresh all the schedulers with the states of all of the slots. So if there's one partition, then you refresh every G seconds, and staleness starts at 0 at the beginning of the round, goes to G at the end, and the average over the course of that is G over 2. But if you partition it, if you've got two partitions, then each synchronization round takes G over 2 seconds, takes half as long, but it only refreshes one of the two partitions. So let's see how this kind of works out over the course of several rounds. So at the beginning, with two partitions, you would sync half the partitions to one of the schedulers. All of the other schedulers are going through a similar life cycle, but we'll just focus on one scheduler. So this scheduler's view of this partition has staleness 0. G over 2 seconds passes, and at this point, the staleness has risen to G over 2. That's how long it's been since the last refresh. And you refresh the other half. And so now its staleness is 0. Then another G over 2 seconds passes. You've come to the end of the final round. Now you've got staleness G on one side, G over 2 of the other. And then the cycle repeats forever. So this means that if you've got two partitions, each sync round takes G over 2 seconds, and the staleness has a different range. So the minimum at the beginning of a round, you've got one of the partitions with staleness 0 and the other with staleness G over 2, because that was refreshed at the beginning of the last round. So the total staleness is G over 4. And then by the end of this round, the freshest partition has a staleness of G over 2. The stale partition now has a staleness of G because it hasn't been refreshed for G seconds. And so the total staleness is 3/4 over G. The average is the same. The average is always G over 2, but the range of staleness is tighter than it was because of partitioned synchronization. So the paper authors say scheduling delay increases disproportionately within the period G. When the cluster state is just synchronized, it is fresher and scheduling has fewer conflicts. But when the state becomes more outdated towards the end of G, scheduling decisions result in more conflicts. Conflicts lead to rescheduling, which may in turn cause new conflicts and hence rescheduling recursively. So staleness is really bad. And by tightening the range here, having a smaller maximum staleness, that saves more conflicts then the larger minimum adds. So if you look at it like this, as staleness increases, the number of conflicts rises faster than linearly. And if you've got this min and this max, then the total staleness is the area under that curve. If you bring the two lines closer together, you've lopped off more area by reducing the max than the amount of area you add by increasing the min. So this whole complicated system, even though it's got the same average staleness, still reduces conflicts because it narrows the range of staleness over time. The final bit of the paper, and then I'll be done, is trading off scheduling quality versus scheduling latency. So after each partitioned synchronization round, each scheduler has a fresh view of some partitions and a stale view of other partitions. And they've got two strategies. You can do latency first scheduling, which is to just commit slots first in the partition that you have a fresh view of. That will minimize conflicts, and so will minimize latency. But you might not get the best quality because there might be higher quality slots in staler partitions, and you're not trying them because you don't want to risk a conflict. The other strategy is quality first scheduling, which is to commit the best slots first, regardless of how stale your view of that is. And the one that they actually implement is called adaptive, where they use quality first. But they've got some SLA. And if latency gets worse than that SLA, then they switch to latency first until the SLA is met again. And then they've got a bunch of graphs. So the experiment that they're running is 90 seconds long. They spend the first 30 seconds with low load, few tasks per second. The next 30 seconds, they divide the schedulers into two groups, and they put very high load on group A. And then for the final 30 seconds, they put a high load on group A and group B. Incidentally, this section sort of surprised me because I thought that all schedulers would receive the same amount of load up until this point, and then all of a sudden they're dividing into groups. I don't understand why you would have a system where some schedulers are taking more of the load than others. Why wouldn't you balance load across the schedulers? But anyway, this is the experiment they do. And if they just use the quality first strategy, then as you would expect, quality stays pretty good and within a narrow band. It's got some kind of oscillation, and I think that's just the synchronization rounds. All views get staler from the start to the end of a round, and then they are partially resynchronized. So I think that's why I think quality decreases over the course of each round of synchronization. And then the delay rises linearly and would rise forever. The system gets overloaded. And it also seems like the two groups of schedulers can't cooperate at all. So the fact that group B is underloaded for the middle section of the experiment doesn't do any good for group A. In the next experiment, they do latency first scheduling only. So quality here is actually not much worse. It seems to be averaging maybe 9.5 as opposed to 10. I think that whether that difference in quality matters to your system probably depends on a lot of factors. In this particular case, they didn't show a very strong difference, but it is a difference. And then the way that delay works is much different. So notice that the scale on the vertical axis is really different here. It tops out at 0.075 seconds rather than 10 seconds. It's also interesting that the two groups of schedulers here seem able to cooperate. So long as only one of them is overloaded, they both have low latency. And then once they're both overloaded, that's when latency really jumps. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, but somehow they're able to cooperate with each other. The final experiment, this is the recommended strategy, which is adaptive. They've set the SLA to 1.5 seconds. So at the beginning, all of the groups are using the quality first strategy until they start to get overloaded, and then you can see quality drop. And for latency, you can see that group A gets overloaded. It allows latency to rise up to 1.5 seconds. And then as soon as it hits it, it switches over to latency first and it caps its latency while maintaining as much quality as it can. And then group B does exactly the same 30 seconds later. So their evaluation of their system is that partitioned synchronization increases the scheduling capacity of our production cluster from a few thousand tasks per second on thousands of machines to 40,000 tasks per second on 100,000 machines. And it reduces conflicts in contending resources to achieve low scheduling delay and high scheduling quality. And the adaptive scheduling strategy balances quality versus scheduling latency. So they're certainly happy with their system. I think that this paper is really nicely explained, but I wish that it hadn't spent quite so much time analyzing all of the things that lead up to partitioned synchronization. We kind of get to the real action part of the paper, maybe 2/3 of the way in. And they really seem to assume that all tasks have the same ranking for slot quality, and that seems like a bad assumption. Some tasks are highly parallelizable, they want lots of cores, others might need a lot of RAM, others might want to run on a machine that had already cached the data that they want. So I think in the real world, quality first scheduling is probably more important than it seems in this experiment. In this experiment, if you choose quality first, it doesn't win you very much because everybody's competing for the same high quality slots. So as the system reaches its maximum capacity, choosing a high quality slot is no good because everybody's already taken it in that round. And so I think latency first looks better in this experiment. In a more heterogeneous environment, you might win more by going for quality first because that slot might actually be free if you are assigning a task that particularly wants that slot. Otherwise,